Thanks very much, Duncan and John. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about an issue which not only in my current professional life is important, but has been important in my previous professional life. When I talk to Treasury officials, I often say, well, I wrote a book on that one, and particularly on federalism issues. And it is an issue that is topical, and not only in Western Australia, which has always been topical, but is one of the major issues facing our nation, challenging. And that is, it comes down to a whole range of issues, and we are, in terms of our federal system, at a kind of a low point. Reached a low point. I'm not playing politics here, but in the terms of last government, it started out with Kevin Rudd in 2007. Kevin Rudd, of course, knew a lot about states. He used to be the Premier of Queensland's Chief of Staff. I met him many, many times. I used to go around commenting on state budgets. He knew the problems and pitfalls of federalism. He knew the problems and issues, specialists of mineral-based state like Queensland. And he came into government in 2007, personally, I think, committed to reforming the federal system. Promoted a whole range of things and had them identified. Didn't do anything on the tax side, but he agreed to look at the fiscal sharing arrangements. But most importantly, at that time, the special purpose grants that were many, varied, with all sorts of strings attached to them. He agreed to simplify them and give more autonomy to the states. Instead, when I then came in 2008 in the government, we looked at a series of policies. Maybe it was spurred on in part by the GFC and the Commonwealth government need to do things. I don't know. But we instead got confronted with a whole range of national partnerships that proliferated. That at peak in July 2012, we had 120 national partnerships that essentially, particularly on health and education, that simply assumed that the states would hand over their schools and their hospitals to a national body to be run. And that is despite and largely run by the Commonwealth bureaucracy. Might add, you heard this often, the Commonwealth health and education bureaucracies, and I'm not criticizing them, they have some very talented people there, have over 5,000, but they don't run a single hospital or school. They actually run one hospital. It's the Mersey Hospital in Tasmania that was actually taken over by the Commonwealth, I don't know why, back a few years ago. And the audit last year found its procedures cost 43% more than the hospitals, the rest of the hospitals in Tasmania or Victoria. We now come to a situation, and I might add, over the last few years, this issue of federalism and the centralism. Historically, I suppose the Labour Party has been more orientated towards centralism, but it didn't really matter in recent times who was dominant in government in Canberra. They were centralist in nature. John Howard was one of the most centralist prime ministers we had. But it's got to the point that I think now, and indeed Tony Abbott, when he wrote a book before he became leader, of course, where he said, if you're liberal, you're a centralist. I went around and did a series of radio interviews following debates with him in the eastern states, and I can remember, I found that hard, but that's what it is. So there's a strong bipartisan Commonwealth perspective towards centralism. Of course, in Western Australia, it's quite the opposite. You scratch a Western Australian politician, whether they're Labour or Liberal, they are federalist in nature and inclination. I'll go through some of the reasons perhaps for that why. But we do have and people who have been in this game, like John and myself, maybe are a bit cynical about change could happen. There is no new issues here. Little variations on the theme, but no new issues. Almost options have been explored. Most of them have been pushed. Most of them haven't succeeded. But I'm optimistic because I have to be, because I think there is a case when things get to the mess at the end, change often is only then possible. And the Abbott government is verbally committed to change. It has a number of processes underway. It has already it came into government, there was a review of the Grants Commission processes. And I won't go at length on that. That's a black box that very few people understand or can predict the outcome of, but it's a very important issue. The Grants Commission, importantly, is a body of the Commonwealth, not a joint body. It also has white papers underway in the Federation and to taxation. And specifically the taxation one is going to consider GST and the sharing of taxation to the states. That's a good step. Also, the Commonwealth budget started the process. It's typical. It could end there, but a forcing change on the states. In other words, it did the usual, withdrew unilaterally a whole range of money that it had from the states. Probably most noticeable was the concessions for seniors. It just unilaterally chopped those and forced us either to backfill or back out. We backed out. And there's a whole raft of these arrangements. And also, the issue in Western Australia it's come to the point. Traditionally, over the years, the Grants Commission process goes back to the 1930s, during the crisis of that period. It's evolved over that time. And I've watched it since the mid-'80s. Never did I see a share go too much below 90, never below 85. That is, all states never got less than 85% of their share of GST back or share. We are now down to 38%. We get 38 cents out of every dollar transferred to the in GST to the Commonwealth back, and our forward estimates, that's going down to 11. We get 11 cents out of every dollar paid in GST from WA. Also, Western Australia has long been a major contributor to the stock of money in the Commonwealth. It's usually been a few $2 to $3 billion, and we can wear that. But this year, Treasury estimates that the total contribution from Western Australia, measured all the payments from Western Australia, including mining tax, which is not very much, and carbon tax and income tax and company tax, less all the payments from the Commonwealth to the state, that is GST and indirect payments and all others. The net contribution from Western Australia to the Commonwealth coffers is $20 billion a year. That's a lot of money, $20 billion. And this is at a time when Western Australia is experiencing its largest, the Premier has asked me not to use this word, boom in history, where we have experienced massive capital investments, massive inflow of people, 3.5% population growth, massive needs for infrastructure, massive needs for diversification, roads, hospitals, electrical facilities, ports, you name it. Over the last 7 years, we've experienced $590 billion worth of investments in the resource sector, and that comes with demands for the state to provide infrastructure. And at that time, we're contributing $20 billion. It's not working. But one of the things that has been debated and it will go on and on, why a federation? Why a federation generally for the nation? Why a federation for Western Australia? The latter one probably doesn't need too much debate, but the former one does, because ever since the foundation of Australia in 1901, there has been a debate about the adoption of a federal system. And it was a federal system. And it's a historical reason. I leave that to historians. But my major argument for why we need a federation is because we have one. Our Constitution is a federal system. Our legal system is a federal system. Our administrative one is a federal system. Our political system is a federal system. We are, whether the people who want centralist arrangements or not, innately and are going to remain a federal system. The debate about getting rid of the states is a waste. It's a good debating thing for academics and others, but it's foregone. It's not going to happen. And there are good reasons for it. And you know, many of you will know that the issue of subsidiarity, that is, the delivery and decision-making and provision of government services, health, education, roads, should be pushed to the lowest level or closest level to the providers of that services. And often that is the states. It also allows for experimentation. Importantly, federal systems allow for experimentation and an insurance against failure. That is, it allows Queensland to go off and experiment on a type of activity that if it doesn't work, that quarantines us in Western Australia who haven't taken that activity to avoid, to learn from it and to avoid the pitfalls of it. And also, it allows constructive competition. I guarantee you, as treasurer, when I talk to my officials and discuss issues of a fiscal nature with my colleagues, we compare ourselves with other states constantly. How does Victoria do it? How does Queensland do it? How do we differ, and why do we differ, and how? It gives a benchmark. It gives competition. Competition can be, if structured properly, very constructive. I'll give you an example of one that comes up with of how the system doesn't work well. The building education revolution, where the Commonwealth under Rudd wanted to stimulate the economy, and they decided to stimulate it through the construction of schools. Okay, good, no problem. The problem was the Commonwealth wanted to do it through public and private schools, great. And they wanted to do it with primary schools. Okay, don't know why that. But instead of going to the states and saying, how can we get this money into the schools as soon as possible, it's a stimulus program, they decided they were going to have an overarching program and have certain types of buildings were going to be built. They were going to be run, ministered by the Commonwealth, but under clear Commonwealth dictates. Certain types of classrooms were going to be built. They would go to each school and say, you get this classroom and that is it. We will have a whole system of auditors and architects vetting this system. The states, however, already had in Western Australia a list for every school what the priority repair and maintenance were, what they would cost, how they would be implemented, and what the priority should be implemented. So if the Commonwealth really wanted to stimulate and help schools, they could have said, each school, here's $1 million, go through your work program. And it could have been done very easily and quickly. Luckily in Western Australia, the Building and Management Department took over that area, spending. In Queensland and New South Wales, they allowed the Commonwealth to undertake the Building Education Revolution program, and it would turn out to be a complete fiasco with buildings built at excessive costs, buildings built at the wrong place. One of my schools, of course, in my electorate is it is a school for special needs kids, and all we wanted was larger toilets. Instead, we got a new kitchen. We have to go raise the money to rip the kitchen out, as the parents do, and put the toilets in. Those issues, it should be brought down to the level. I don't think there's any debate now, even those who believe that we shouldn't have a federal system, that the federal system we have here now is not working. It is not allocating money to the best area. Its overlap and duplication is large. It is a very costly system. Indeed, the mechanism, whether it be the Grants Commission upon which the government allocates money between the states, the taxation system the states have, which are distortive, and also the overlap and duplication is very large. So I think there's just general agreement we need to do something about it. The question is what? As from Western Australia, I think we've always identified with the federal system since Federation for a variety of reasons. First, we're over here, far away. It's a long ways away. Second, we are exceptional in many ways than other states. We have a very rapidly growing population. We have a mineral-based economy of almost, in terms of the OEC, a unique nature. Huge levels and spurts of investments that are required, with huge increases in population, and also very isolated areas. Most of our mining and activity is far away. We have a large number of very isolated and impoverished often communities. We have a very young population. We are about as different from Tasmania as you can almost get and be in the same nation and in the same basic economy. And these differences are why we believe why there should be a federation. We should be able to adjust to the needs and abilities of a state like Western Australia that are different from Tasmania and still be in the same nation. Unfortunately, the system that we have doesn't articulate this well. And when we came into federation, I think the problems were sold early on in two things. First, for three areas. First, there were certain aspects of the Constitution that weren't precise enough, and Alfred Deakin's warnings at the time that the states would be legally free but financially bound to the chariot's wheels of the central government were not adhered to. First, there was a Section 96 of the Constitution provides for the Commonwealth to provide grants on such terms and conditions as the Commonwealth Parliament allows them to do that. And Section 90, Customs and Excise Duties, it prohibits the states from levying customs and excise, and therefore sales tax of various types, limits the taxation powers of the state more significantly than, let's say, other federations, whether it be Germany, India, Canada, or the U.S. Also, the High Court has been generally interpreted laws in favor of centralization. I won't go through all those, but from the High Court engineers case in 1920 to the Franklin Dam case, which allowed external powers, the Commonwealth to use external powers and company tax powers, company powers to override states, and to the 1997 High Court tobacco case that threw out franchise fees, which were a major source of revenue to the states. There's also an issue with the theoretical foundations of Australia called, I think in the literature, called the Westminster system, where at the time of federation you had two conflicting ideologies in the formation of Australian federation. One is you had the Washingtonian system, the U.S. system, where the founding fathers of that nation were clearly adopted a federal system to restrict the behavior, actions, and activities of the central government. That's what they did. It was all checks and balances. Whereas we have in Australia a Westminster system where Parliament is paramount. There are no checks on the powers of the Parliament, and specifically in this case, the federal Parliament. So you had this conflict in the interpretation of the Constitution. One is the federal system restricts, the other one, the Westminster system, nothing restricts. And it's been that tension within it all the way. Then there's another issue, is that all us politicians like to address any issue that comes before us from our constituents. And all politics are local. So as a local member of Riverton, I deal as much with the actions of the city of Canning, which is a local government, than I deal with my own. Likewise, you'll notice the Commonwealth like to, in fact always do, deal more with state issues than they often do with federal. And so it's the natural politics of wanting to deal. No issue is off the plate when you're trying to address the issues of your constituency. That's just politics. What is wrong with the West Australian or the Federation? Now, there have been many attempts over the years to try to address this. Malcolm Fraser, God rest him, tried back in the 1970s to reform federalism. I remember the process. I was new to Australia, but remember debating it and looking at it. And what one of his aims is to give income taxing powers back to the states. As you know, the states initially on formation of the Federation had the income taxation powers. Then they made a fatal error. During the war, World War II, they gave, theoretically for the duration of the war, income taxation powers over to the Commonwealth for national purposes. Not surprisingly, those powers never came back. And the Commonwealth increased the rate of income tax such that the states could not come back into the space. Well, Malcolm Fraser decided that they could have the states, he was going to allow the states a piggyback income tax like other federations have, Canada and the U.S., where the states could come back into the income tax space and also piggyback or use the base of the Commonwealth tax. Unfortunately, he never reduced the rate. And back then, the rates of income tax were 70, 80%, so there was no space. Then Bob Hawke, through the 1980s, came, quite rightly, to the logical conclusion that one of the last great untouched microeconomic reform was that to the federal system. And he suggested the same thing. That is, to implement reform to allow the states to put in to piggyback income tax. And his was different. He was going to create the space. Enter Paul Keating's chase for the lodge, and this is the issue that Paul Keating won the lodge on. That is, he campaigned against Bob Hawke's attempt to give power to the states. And then we had very little since then on the tax side, except in 2001 when John Howard, an ardent centralist, and he would admit that, decided to give the states a growth tax, the GST. And he successfully won an election on that basis. Impressive. I might add, and I might go back to this later on, the Commonwealth Treasury had their own little agenda back, I think, in 1971, when confronted with repeated claims or clamors by the states for a growth tax, the Commonwealth at that time, under the Commonwealth Treasury suggestion, gave the states payroll tax, which was theoretically a growth tax. So there was a number of attempts to reform, but they didn't address the major issue. First, in a couple of ways. First, the income tax powers have been effectively closed off for the states. Second, during that period, the various other growth, large base taxes have been lost. The High Court has declared the states cannot levy an excise. The states have narrowed the base of payroll tax to almost nothing. Only about less than 10% of companies pay payroll tax, narrowed the base. And the GST, of course, doesn't raise as much revenue as they thought, because the deal with the Democrats at the time narrowed the base, and it hasn't grown. But more importantly, the GST is put through this redistribution mechanism through the Grants Commission. So we haven't had effective tax reform at the state basis. We've eliminated some tax. In fact, through the GST, we've come out. We eliminated a whole range of nuisance taxes, stamp duty taxes in mind. We've kept some, quite a few. We've eliminated those, and we've come out of that system more dependent upon the Commonwealth for revenue than we went in. That is the vertical fiscal imbalance. That is, the Commonwealth raises most of the money and the states do most of the spending, has got worse. And we still do not have under our control and predictably a predictable tax base. I might add, another issue is go to the Commonwealth Grants Commission. This is a mechanism that developed since the 1930s. It's a very complex thing. I can't profess to understand it, even though I've looked at it many, many times. And basically what it tries to do, it's a giant socialist redistribution mechanism. It takes the GST, the pool, and calculates what every state gets, and it does it on this basis. It finds out what states' revenue-raising capacity is, and Western Australia's is phenomenally high. It gets royalties from a whole range of things, including iron ore, and it has 30% higher average incomes than the rest of the states. So it taxes according to one's ability and gives revenue according to one's needs. I've heard that statement before. And then it redistributes it so that Western Australia gets little and Tasmania gets a phenomenal lot. The Northern Territory gets a lot. In fact, the Northern Territory, which has 240,000 people, the same size as the city of Stirling, gets now $1 billion more in total GST payments than Western Australia. So it's basically equalizing capacity, equalizing needs, and basically the aim is that every state and territory should be able to provide the same level of services as everybody else. Now, there's some problems to that. First, the Grants Commission's process is not perfect. Second, it has an income effect in that it's telling Tassie, if you lock up all your forest, lock up all your mines, and destroy growth, you will get compensated for it from the proceeds from WA. And we've had a lot of debates, but that's what it does. Second, it is an imperfect. Treasury officials spend most of their life, well, they used to, they still do. The Treasury's expanded a bit into other areas and does well, but spends most of their life trying to argue about the data and the data imperfections and be able to measure this. You don't really know what you're going to get in terms of equalization. And it also is backcast. So in terms of allocating for today, what we're looking at is what the data shows 3 to 5 years in the past. So in Western Australia, we went through this phenomenal boom, and we were getting a lot of iron ore royalties, but we were getting hit with huge demand for infrastructure, electricity, roads, everything. But the data where the money we were getting was in the past. So it's backcast. But more importantly, it's a really important issue. It is a dead weight on the growth of the nation. What it's essentially doing is taking money away from areas that are growing and adding value, like Western Australia, and putting it places, redistributing it to places that there's no growth. Keeping people in northwest Tasmania, it's a beautiful place, keeping people in northwest Tasmania where there are no jobs, there's no prospects, and taking people out of the north of Western Australia. This is not a growth-orientated system. It is a system that has good equity grounds but not growth grounds. And it's a system, by the way, that is largely controlled by the Commonwealth. And there is also another, besides the Grants Commission, we've had this huge growth over the years, and it's waxed and waned, but mainly growth into intrusion of Commonwealth on a whole range of state activity, whether it be, I've already mentioned schools and hospitals, but almost all aspects of state activity, whether they have any direct policy input to it, whether they have even any national perspective on it or not, the Commonwealth has intruded in. Through grants of various times, sometimes tied, sometimes not, usually very tied, and still often matching. This has overlap and duplication, confusion of who's running, and it also puts the states in a very invidious position in that from two ways. First, if you enter into a dance along the way with the Commonwealth, agree to a joint program, they might pull the money out from under you. And this happened this year in the budget. We all of a sudden lost money on health in particular, but also concessions to seniors, even though we had agreed to have these programs. Another issue was to compensation for native title campaigns, native title claims, legitimate ones once they go through the process. The state and Commonwealth sometimes, about 15 years ago, agreed to jointly fund these, though the sharing was not agreed. Commonwealth changed its mind. We need to proceed with those compensation claims. The state has to bear the interest of it. So there's and also there's a massive duplication of administration, and might add, one of the major issues is it has hurt our tax base because states, particularly when the Commonwealth, let's say, pulled back a program, they have to be funded in many instances. We just can't pull back from funding an Aboriginal health program, $30 million. So we have to find the funds from somewhere else. And our tax base itself are very inefficient. Part of it's our own treatment of our, let's say, our payroll tax base, but most of our tax, the largest tax base is, besides payroll, is stamp duty on housing transactions, which is actually a tax on people moving house. About as dumb as you can get. We have the highest levels of stamp duties of any country other than Ireland. And people are not moving around Ireland, they're coming here now. So, so we become forces to rely more and more on inefficient taxes. But this diagnosis is well known. It is difficult to change, but it has to change. What are we doing about it? Okay, as I mentioned, the Commonwealth has a series of reforms underway, both into the Grants Commission process, the Federation generally, the structure of it, and of course taxation. We treat those with the, we respect them for initiating them. though we have been a lot around this path before, we are treating it with an open mind. We are also participating in it fully. And I also take there are some signs, particularly from the Abbott government, crude, but nonetheless, they have made it clear to us repeatedly and privately in public forums that they want to straighten out the overlap and duplication. They want to sit down and delineate roles and responsibility between the states and the federal government. That's a good starting point. Hopefully, they also want to agree to areas that can separate those. This is going to take a great deal of courage on the part of a Commonwealth minister who, when somebody, let's say Disability Services, comes to them and has a legitimate claim for assistance, where the Commonwealth minister says, don't ask me, ask the state. So there's some courage behind this. But they have agreed to sit down and delineate. It's a good step. That hasn't started yet. They also, quid pro quo, which they understand, is that if you do that, you also have to allow the state to have a resource or a tax base that accommodates their needs. And because of, if you're implementing the subsidiary, the states will retain the responsibility for the bulk of provisioning. Electricity, that's almost wholly gone in most hands. Hospitals, schools, roads, those types of things, not the Commonwealth. And which means some reform on the revenue side. They have agreed to look at the Grants Commission both in this formal process and other discussions. The Grants Commission process, my own view is fundamentally flawed, not only for the reasons I said, but too much money goes through that Grants Commission. It equalizes too much. We are arguing, the Premier, Colin Barnett, has argued that there should be a floor on the redistribution. Instead of us getting, let's say, 37, 38%, there should be a floor above that of some level. That's one argument. Another one is to not put all the GST through the Grants Commission process, redistribute some, but put others through a per capita allocation. Okay? That's been on the table for a long time. And also there's some one of the problems with the Grants Commission problem, the biggest thing that drives redistribution now is actually iron ore royalties. Our iron ore royalties have gone from 5% of our total revenue to 20% over the last 10 years. We get over $6 billion in iron ore royalties. No other state has iron ore industry. No other state has iron ore royalties of any sense. So it's a unique one. So you treat these unique industries uniquely, an argument, which would lead to a larger redistribution. The challenge with all this is that the Grants Commission is not only a socialist redistribution, it's also treated as a zero-sum game. A gain to us is a loss to somebody else. A gain to us is a loss to Tasmania. That's in a non-dynamic sense. In a dynamic sense, a gain to us, one would argue, at the margin, is a gain to the nation and the national growth, because we will put it into infrastructure for export-oriented activities rather than redistribution, and expand the whole pie, income tax and company tax base, that Commonwealth can then redistribute to Tasmania. But strangely enough, the Commonwealth Tasmanian, the Tasmanian premiers have a hard time understanding or accepting that, as does the South Australians. That's a tough one. It is, however, the crux of the issue. The crux of the issue. And the industry that is at the forefront of it, actually, is not iron ore royalties. We get a large amount of iron ore. They get redistributed. Prices are a bit low right now. But LNG. LNG will be the nation's largest export industry in a couple of years, thanks to us and the Queenslanders. We will be the largest exporter of LNG in the world. And there is still significant scope for exports. However, Western Australia spends huge amounts of money putting the infrastructure in to facilitate the LNG sector. Yes, the firms put a lot in, huge amount in, but we provide towns, roads, power, transport, airports, you name it, we do it, right? Billions. Yet we get not a single cent from the LNG industry. We get a bit from Northwest Shelf. That's a historic issue, but not a single cent for the LNG. And you could see governments of Western Australia and say, acting rationally by investing less into the LNG sector, because we get nothing for it. And if we do it, it gets 90 cents out of every dollar gets redistributed to other states, so why do it? We've never done that. No, all governments in Western Australia have been pro-development, but that's a disincentive. Particularly if you're getting down to 11 cents of every dollar, that's the incentive you face. So we have to look at the Grants Commission. The Grants Commission actually is a body, though the states work together on it, that is the responsibility of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth can change it. The Commonwealth can determine the process. We also have to as Abbott has agreed to, and so has Matthias Cormann and others, sat down and start delineate roles and responsibility. Very, very important. And to be honest, schools, this Commonwealth should just get out of any design to run schools. It's important that they continue, to my view, to fund private schools, because I tell you, if the states had to fund private schools, they would always favor their own schools that they own. One of the important things in Australia is we have a dual system. So they should fund private schools. They should make sure that kids are mobile around Australia. They should keep the NAPLAN test, the national testing system. They should keep all the higher level policy issues, but they should allow the states to run the schools and to monitor their performance. Same with hospitals and a whole raft of other issues. There are areas, of course, you get into complexity. For instance, national disability services, where you have national insurance schemes, but even that, you have close delineation. As to tax base and tax reform on the state basis going forward, I think most states now look at the GST as a bit of a failure. I was a strong advocate for the GST back then, although I recognized that it was actually increasing the vertical fiscal imbalance, having the states more dependent upon the Commonwealth, but at least it got rid of some of those destructive taxes and also gave a growth tax to the states collectively. What we didn't envisage was two things. One is that the growth in consumption was going to go away from the areas covered by the GST, and those areas not covered or exempted from the GST were going to be the growth areas: health, education, food, and others. So GST's share of total consumption is actually stagnant. So it hasn't been overall growth tax to the states and territory sector. Second thing is, it goes through the Grants Commission process that basically is a giant redistribution mechanism. So in that we come back to. What do we do in the future? Well, it's clear that, well, it's not clear, but it's reading the tea leaves. You can see that we are going to have, in the run-up to the next election, a talk on GST. No one said that officially. I'm not saying that right now. We are not going to push it. We will never push that for a simple reason. If the GST goes up, we get less. The Western Australian government is not going to push the case for a GST because we will get only 11 cents out of every dollar put in. So why would we do it? That's come up in the case of GST on internet purchase goods. There's a cap on that now of 1,000 people, $1,000 below that you're exempt. The eastern states want to lower that towards 200. I've said, the Premier said, no, we won't get our share back. We're going to use the GST debate as a leverage to change the way GST is delivered. That's our, and we will, beyond that, we won't step until we get the change in the distribution system. That's where. As to other aspects of tax change, there aren't many options available to us. We have reached a dry gulch in terms of our tax base, so I can't see too much tax reform on that. As to piggyback income tax, though it's a nice theoretical issue, I suspect strongly that in the end the Commonwealth will not allow the states, who they often don't trust, to enter into the income tax sphere. And there's a good reason why. Is that on forward estimates on the Commonwealth, the marginal tax rate, people on medium-term incomes, median incomes, will, in a year or so, maybe 2-3 years, will be at the top marginal tax rate. The last thing they want is higher tax rates, income tax rates, to push even more medium income earners into 50% plus tax. So I don't think the piggyback income tax in the foreseeable future is on. Commonwealth is going to discuss that. They will probably explore the GST, but our perspective is it ain't the GST, it's the sharing of the arrangements for those. And more importantly, and delineate roles and responsibilities between the states. One could get cynical in this business, especially people like myself who have been across it for a while, but you got to put cynicism aside, and eventually the system grinds to a halt and it's got to be fixed, and that's where it is now. Thanks very much.